Welcome everybody. This is Jeff Cantor here for another episode of Freedom Hub Working Group, along with my co-host Charles Froman. We are being sponsored by your Freedom Hub, where all the activists and entrepreneurial disruptors tend to congregate. We've got a great guest in store for us today, but before we break into that for one quick minute, let me then tell you that these are all being recorded. This is the link you want to go to at the top to register to see future ones and get notices when they're going to be repeating other new episodes, and we'll talk about who's coming up down the road. And then also, these are the various channels that we post these at every weekend. So come Monday morning, you can always come and see the latest releases, whichever of these you prefer to go to. These are case sensitive, these particular links, so you'll make sure you write that down correctly. And then to show you, this is one of them. So just as a flavor, this is the Freedom Hub Working Group on Brighteon's site, and as you'll see, there's a wealth of videos, goes back for a long time, many pages of these, some really fantastic topics for sure. You'll really want to come back here and take a deeper dive. And as I said, we are being sponsored by your Freedom Hub. Now, for today, we've got Laura Ebke, and so she's got an interesting background. I'll kind of click through a couple sites here. She was a political animal for a while there, and we'll certainly have to see if she's got any comments and how much she enjoyed that era of her life. And then subsequent to that, though, she's now here at the Platte Institute, which is based in Nebraska, but is working a little more broadly. And today she's going to be talking about the idea of licensing. And so that's really a very important topic for all of us. And we were commenting before about how this COVID crisis might actually help accelerate that which she's been trying to work on. So Laura, thanks for coming today. I'm going to stop sharing and give you control of the screen.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Jeff. And let me get my screen shared here. Okay, so hopefully you can see it now.
I can.
Awesome. Okay, well, so you're right. I am with the Platte Institute, and tell you a little bit about myself. I was a late bloomer in terms of my education. I went to the University of Nebraska, graduated with a PhD in 2005. So I always say that I was on the 25-year plan. It took me 25 years from the time I graduated from high school till I finally got, finally finished college. Did a few things along the way between 1980 and 2005, though. And I was very content. I was on the Crete School Board here in my hometown, and was very content with doing that until Nebraska created a term limit situation where the local state senator in our district was term limited out. And one day I was coming to the point where I'd been on the school board for 12 years, and my dad called me up one day and he says, "What about Senator Ebke?" And I kind of laughed at him, and then it kind of got under my, got under my skin. And a few months later, I filed and decided to make a run for it. Won by 187 votes in my first election, and had some. I was always sort of a libertarian-leaning Republican. And in 2016, I made the switch, became an actual libertarian, and as a result, at least partially as a result, I lost my bid for re-election in 2018. But it's all been good because I've had the opportunity now to work with the Platte Institute and to do some things that I think take advantage of my experience and my background in a way that I couldn't fully use those things in the legislature. So what I want to do is talk to you just a little bit about occupational licensing, then ask any kind of questions you might have, because I think we have some real opportunities given the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the changes that we've seen. So let's see if I can, there we go. So let me ask you first, is this a logical journey? And I don't think it is. We're told that licenses were created to protect the public health, safety, and welfare of the people. We're told that states, we know this, states are the primary issuers of occupational licenses. and that the states really all they want to do is to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. That is their primary duty as part of their police powers. And hence, we have gone from a time in roughly 1960 when about 1 in 20 people had to be licensed in order to work in their occupation, to today when somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people have to be licensed by the state in order to work. So what we're really looking at is the government permission slip to work. So if states are the primary issuers of our occupational licenses, and the purpose of licenses are to protect the public health, safety, and welfare, it seems to me that there's a little bit of a disconnect when we get to the point when we have a crisis situation in which public health, safety, and welfare are at stake. What we've got right now. And then you see states, including Nebraska, but virtually every state throws out many of the occupational, licensing rules. And so keep that in mind. So for the record, from March through April of 2020, just this year, 2 months, 6 weeks or so, over half of the states in the country have issued some sort of a universal recognition or reciprocity for healthcare professionals. Okay, so nurses, physicians, pharmacists, respiratory therapists, all of these things. If you have a license in one state, they say, come on in. You can cross county, you can cross the state lines. We recognize your license. And that's what's known as universal recognition. It's very similar to what Arizona did a year or so ago, I guess last year. And in terms of saying, if your license is good in Nebraska, you can come and practice in Arizona. And so we are, I'm happy to see this happening. I wish we'd seen a little bit more of it a little bit sooner. And this is one thing that we need to keep in mind in terms of an opportunity for the future. Okay, a lot of states have issued waivers for licensure of healthcare professionals who had retired or let their licenses go inactive. So basically, if you had practiced in a state for sometime in the last 5 years and decided to retire or decided to take a new, go in a different career path, and you were a nurse or a physician assistant or a respiratory therapist or any number of other things that require licenses, nurses' aides or the CNAs are included in that in many cases, then what the state has said is that they will, just come on in and, they waive all of the requirements for continuing education and things like that. As long as your license was in good standing when you left, come on in and work. So that's another thing that raises questions, I think, about the value of some of the continuing education requirements and whether or not licensing requirements are really designed for keeping the public health and safety, or whether they're designed for some other purposes. And we can certainly talk about those at some point. Some states have created means of licensure without testing or fulfilling all of the normal requirements. You see that especially in things like the certified nurses' aides. They're doing what they used to do. They're saying, come on in if you want to work as a nurse's aide, and we're going to go ahead and just train you on the job, which is what they used to do. But now you have to take, in Nebraska anyhow, you have to take classes and you have to pass tests and you have to pay a licensure fee. But that's been waived in a number of states for the duration of this, pandemic at least. And so, and you also have some instances where states, Iowa I think was one of them, said, hey, if you're about done, if you've just graduated or you're just getting ready to graduate from your residency or from your medical school, or from your internship, we're going to go ahead and waive the requirements. If your schools think that you're qualified, we're going to go ahead and waive the requirements and let you go ahead and be licensed to practice now without having taken the tests and so forth. So there's a lot of things that are being waived that provide for a little bit of a disconnect, I think, when it comes to the value of licensing for protecting public health and safety and so forth. And then once we get outside of these sort of occupational licensing for healthcare professionals, the scope and practice and so forth, we all have seen countless other regulations lifted as well, both in and out of healthcare. We talked a little while ago, Jeff, about telemedicine opening way up. But here in Nebraska, we also have, our governor has said, you know what, we need to figure out a way to keep restaurants and bars open, these small businesses especially. And so we're going to let, we're going to let you serve your food outside of the, outside of the building, take it out and do curbside delivery. We're also going to let you, serve drinks on the street, basically as long as it's in a sealed container, something with a lid on it, margaritas to go. And this is happening around the country, but Nebraska has been very, very visible in doing that. So what does that mean? Excuse me. I think that we can make, take the lemons of the pandemic, because it has certainly, been full of lemons in many sorts of ways. Lots of people have complained about the lack of liberty and freedom and the threats to liberty and freedom. And I think that what it does, though, is it provides us more opportunities for freedom over the long term. Okay, we can get past, once we can get past some of the civil liberties, stuck in your home kind of questions, which I think will pass because historically they do. I think there's room for us in the regulatory environment to really make some huge changes. So some of the opportunities that we have for states, and I think that states everywhere ought to be thinking about these things, is look for things like universal recognition. Universal recognition is really just saying, there's no reason, you don't lose your skills if you move from Nebraska to Ohio or from Ohio to Arizona. You don't lose your skills. So why should you have to start all over? And in some states, that's exactly what they require you to do, or if not start over completely, to go back to school. Even if you've got 10 years of experience cutting hair, you may have to go back to, you may have to go back to school and get additional hours if you move into the wrong state. So I think that that's something that we should certainly be looking at as people who love liberty. Nebraska, several other states, as well as several other states, had universal recognition bills running this year. They didn't get anywhere because of the delay in the legislative session, in part because it may not have been its time yet. But I think that next year and the year after that will be great opportunities for folks trying to push for universal recognition, because we have seen the governors say that it's okay for the most, the most significant occupations in terms of public health and safety, the healthcare professionals. Something else that I think that states could be working for, and I would encourage folks to work on this, is to create review processes similar to what Nebraska did in 2018, which Ohio did, I think, in 2019. And what that does is it gives the legislature the opportunity to require justification for the continuing licensure of certain occupations. So in Nebraska, every 5 years, on a rotating basis, 20% of the licenses are reviewed every year by legislative committees of jurisdiction, meaning that every 5 years, a specific license is going to have to be reviewed, and justify at some level its continued existence. So, how many people are licensed? How many people have you found who are practicing the occupation without a license who have done harm to somebody? How many complaints have you had about unlicensed persons, performing certain tasks and that sort of thing? So, we need to find out if there's really public harm involved, if there's really health and safety issues involved. And what we tend to find, I think, and most people will agree, is that much of what happens in occupational licensing happens because the professionals, the occupations, want to be licensed so that they can limit their competition. They may not say that, but that's the effect. They want to limit who can come in, who can try to provide the same service that they do. Because if there's a glut, and we were talking about Milton Friedman earlier, if there's a glut in electricians, say, okay, then what happens? The wages for electricians go down. It's a supply and demand kind of thing. And so from the standpoint of electricians or any other occupation, cosmetologists or barbers or whatever, if there are too many of what they consider out there practicing, then the prices will go down, their income will potentially shrink. And so it's important for us to keep in mind that protectionist nature of occupational licensing. Another thing that states can do is look at sunrise reviews. We tried to put that in the bill that I carried in 2018. The sunrise review was sort of a sticker for us because we didn't have a good way to do it. But if you live in a state where there are occupational boards that oversee some of these things, they could certainly do it. The idea of the sunrise review is that before you even license anything, you should be thinking about whether it's necessary to license them. Too many times, the desire to license by the occupations themselves brings a bill to the legislature, and the legislature, not hearing anybody say, no, we shouldn't do that, it's not necessary, but only hearing from those who are proponents saying this is vitally important for public health and safety. The legislature says, yeah, okay. And that's how we ended up with, I think we have 180 licenses on the books in Nebraska, different licenses, many of them, sort of working class and middle class licenses, and most states are like that. And then finally, in the interest of public health and safety, governors reduce the regulatory burden on those most intimately involved with health and safety. This suggests that maybe health and safety wouldn't be negatively impacted by a reduction of regulation. So, I think that that's the case that can be made around the country in every state out there, that, you did this when, we were all going to die. So maybe it's time for us to rethink whether or not it's really necessary to maintain some of these licensing structures. And one of the things that we should always ask, and this is something that we talk about a lot, and when you had Lee McGrath on a few months ago, I think he talked about it as well. The question that we should always be asking is least restrictive means. What is the least restrictive means? That your lawmakers should say, if some form of regulation is necessary, does that regulation have to come from the state? And I would argue that, for instance, with respect to physicians that we talked about earlier, the local hospitals decide who gets credentialed. Local hospitals decide whether or not they're going to let somebody practice surgery, even though in most states all physicians are licensed to practice medicine and surgery. Not all of them are going to be practicing surgery because the local hospitals say, no, you're not going to do that. So I think that's important. Is there some form of regulation that's necessary? Does the state have to be the one that does it? Certainly, Non-governmental entities can provide adequate assurance for competence to the public, whether it's through board certification or other kinds of certification through private agencies. And the reality of it is that there was a study done a couple of months ago. I lose track of time these days, but it was a couple of months ago, came out from Harvard, I think it was, and they talked about occupational licensing. And they said that really most people don't pay any attention, and this was in the construction area. Most people don't pay any attention to whether or not a contractor is licensed. What they look at is whether or not they get good reviews on Yelp and Google, Google reviews and things like that. So in an era of the internet, when most people can, look and see, about reviews of their plumber or their HVAC guy or their dentist or whoever, that the licensing is probably not as necessary. Maybe 30 or 40 years ago, it was more important to make sure that, disreputable folks weren't coming in, but the market works. And since the market works, it's important to let it work and pull as much of the pull as much of the licensing out as we can through whatever means that we can. So, the other question to ask is always, what is the real public health risk that's mitigated by state licensing? I alluded to this earlier. I never once in my 4 years in the legislature, and not in the last 2 years that I've been sitting through hearings, I've never once seen the public come and ask for licensure for any occupation. Rather, what happens is you see the local professionals, the local practitioners who are seeking licensing of some sort. So is the public really being harmed? And I think probably the public is being harmed more by licensing because it hurts from a consumer standpoint. It ends up raising the cost of activities for them. So that being said, I mentioned earlier our little multi-state effort that we are undergoing. Platte Institute wants to help others, other states, other organizations and groups to do whatever they can in their state. And so people should feel free to give me a call or send me an email at any time, and this will be here. And I think that when you send the information out, Jeff, it'll be available for folks as well. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them at this point.
Fantastic. Thanks, Laura. That was quite good. And yes, I will put all that information out for everybody. I had a couple questions first because I see some hands are up. First off, just kind of backing way up at the beginning of your talk when you were in office.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it was a positive that you changed political parties while you were in office, or was that maybe hurt? Like there was some backlash from that particular party for abandoning them midstream? It would have maybe been better to switch parties and then run for re-election under the different banner? And the separate question, regardless of the answer to that one, did you switching parties improve the standing and where the Libertarian Party in the state sits today because of what you did?
Okay, that's a complicated question, but yes. Well, probably politically, it would have been better for me to not switch parties or whatever. I think that what you have to remember about the Nebraska legislature is that it's nonpartisan. We don't organize by party.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so we're elected on a nonpartisan ballot. So my party registration never showed up anyplace. So to the extent that people knew what party I belonged to, it was based on public discussions that we had, or people that other parties saying, "Oh, she's just another whatever,"
Right.
And
right.
so it didn't really affect, and I don't think it affected negatively my impact in the legislature. And in fact, after I switched parties in 2017, after we had the 2016 elections, in 2017, as a new libertarian, I was elected chair of the Judiciary Committee by my colleagues, and I was able to pass this occupational licensing bill on a virtually unanimous. I think it was 45 to, I think we had one abstention or something like that, and 2 absent. We've got 49 in our body. So I don't think that it hurt me. and it didn't hurt my effectiveness. It probably hurt me politically, because certainly there were people out there who thought that I had run away, or that I was
Yeah,
some sort of a
betrayed him or
traitor.
something.
Yeah, I
Sure.
heard the traitor thing a few times on the porches.
Mm-hmm.
But I was always very honest with people. In 2014, when I ran the first time, and I said, I have very libertarian ideas. I am a libertarian Republican. I was part of the Republican Liberty Caucus. People knew that I had worked with the Ron Paul campaigns in 2008 and 2012. So, I mean, it shouldn't have been a secret to anybody. It shouldn't have been a surprise, especially given some of the other political things that were going on here.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Interesting.
and
Well,
you asked another question too. I don't
the
remember
other
what.
one was, but did that also move forward the position of the Libertarian Party in the state, you having done that?
I think so. David would probably be better better able to speak to that. Although at some level, I think that it did. We had a significant increase in the number of registered voters,
Mm.
libertarian registered voters in Nebraska. And one of the things that I was able to get done in 2017 was to get the Libertarian Party permanent ballot access. So as long as, any party that has at least 10,000 registered voters in the state now has permanent ballot access, doesn't have to try to petition, doesn't have to worry about running a gubernatorial candidate and getting at least 5% of the vote and that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, that's always been a game changer in any of the states where you can gain that permanent ballot status. You can spend all your time campaigning and not just trying to be on the ballot.
Yeah.
So that is an improvement. On the topic of licensing, I myself hold a health insurance license.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've seen through the years how that's become more involved and costly, and continuing education and all the rest of the stuff. But yet, when you talk about who's this benefiting, because, who in the state is qualified to say that you're the doctor or whatever? So for
Right.
them to issue the license, it's like, well, what authority and expertise do they have to even be issuing a license in the very first place? How many air conditioning units have you repaired there, state licensure person?
Right.
None. So how can you tell me that I should be licensed or not, or if I'm good or not? Like you said, the market works because it shows. Well, to show you how comical, and you can kind of broadly comment, historically there was continuing education, and then every company had a continuing education, and lo and behold, it was identical to the other company. So I have to do 5 of identical training classes, one after another on a weekend. It was ludicrous, the redundancy of it. And then you would have to do like a state licensing every couple years. So you take all these particular classes, and then you take this exam. Well, now it's reached the point where I can take the classes and literally type in the word "here" periodically, and therefore forego having to take the test.
There you
So
go.
now you start to see, now what is the value of what I'm even doing if I don't even need to be tested on this material? How about next year I just give you the money and I don't even sit in the class nor take the test? How about that? And I'm sure they'd be content with that, because it's starting to feel like a lot of this is make work and just a scam or scheme to get more money somehow.
I think that your experience is similar to what a lot of occupations feel in terms of occupational licensing and continuing education. They feel like it's sort of a shakedown, that you have to pay to take the class, you have to go spend some money someplace to take the classes, to get the continuing education, and then you have to be able to prove that you've taken the continuing education. It's interesting when you look at the occupational licensing boards in most states, certainly in Nebraska, that the membership of the boards tends to be made up dominantly by people who are in the occupation. Okay, so there is a certain level of conflict of interest there when they determine who they're going to let in based on licensing, licensing standards and continuing education standards and so forth. We also find in some states that when you start talking about things like massage therapy and cosmetology and those sorts of things, that a lot of the people on the licensing boards actually own the schools that teach those things. Okay, so do they have some sort of a conflict of interest in terms of saying, well, gosh, you have to have 500 more hours than in a particular course of study. You have to have 500 more hours in order to be licensed than any other state in the country. So you find examples like this all over the place as you start digging into the licensing issue. And I believe that solid professionals in all sorts of occupations will go out and they're going to do independent reading. They're going to try to keep up to date on things, and if they don't, the market takes care of it, and they will no longer have people coming in because somebody else is going to be doing a better job.
Partially, and just my last comment too, what I've also noticed is as I'm doing any of this continuing education, the bulk of it is like 101 level information.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, well, wait a minute, I've been in this business all these years. If I'm to take these kind of classes, what kind of incompetence do you think are actually in this field?
Right.
We're way beyond the caliber of the stuff they teach in this continuing education. I got to imagine that's true for most professions.
I think it probably is. And so much of the time, what they want to do is they want to, the argument with that is that they want to make sure that they're maintaining the minimum standards. And that in order to maintain the minimum standards, you need to go off and take these courses over and over and over again. And I think your experience is probably very similar to what many others. I've talked to people in a lot of different occupations who say they'll go off to these schools, and they will they'll check in, and that way they can get credit. But then they'll go off and do something else. Physicians are amongst the worst, I think. They routinely have their continuing education conferences in places like Disney World and Hawaii and things like that. So they go off, they get a week's worth of continuing education, and and they don't spend a whole lot of time probably in a lot of the classes.
Sounds about right. Murray, I know you've got a question here.
Yeah, Laura, Murray Feldstein, the Goldwater Institute in Arizona. And I agree with just about everything you said. I can't argue with you because I've been writing about this and working in this for a long time. I'm a retired physician, and I think I know the ins and outs of medical licensure. And I wanted to talk to you just a second about the Sunrise process, because we had that in Arizona. And it turns out, like everything, it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And we were fortunately able to reform it. And I would love to get rid of it. I realize its good purpose, but where it was being used in Arizona was to use it to, for example, let's say nurse practitioners wanted to increase their scope of practice. Well, this engendered a Sunrise application. And the Sunrise application was then forwarded to all the, quote, stakeholders, which included, of course, the doctors' groups.
Mm-hmm.
So when the nurse practitioners wanted to increase the scope of practice to write prescriptions, which, by the way, in Arizona is a full practice state for nurse practitioners. We have one of the more advanced and I would say one of the more libertarian rules of any state for licensure, including the universal reciprocity that was passed last year. A lot of it due to the work of the Goldwater Institute, which is like the Platte Institute, works on a state level. And what would happen is the nurse anesthetist would like to work without supervision or they had that right, but they couldn't get paid by Medicare unless they had an MD and anesthesiologist supervise them, which I won't go into the history of the thing, but that's crazy. And pharmacists, if they wanted to give flu shots to kids or something, same thing. It would be Sunrise application. And what this meant is it would go to the two committees, one in each house of the legislature. And it turned out that you couldn't even introduce the legislation unless the Sunrise committees approved it. Well, it more than likely, the medical organizations came in and argued, and by a vote of 1, they would deny the increased scope of practice for the nurses. It never even got a hearing in the legislature. So we changed that a couple of years ago. The pharmacists particularly were very busy doing that. Same with the optometrists. And now they can't hold it back from at least seeing an introduction into the legislature if a piece of legislation wants to get introduced. And the only reason I wanted to say that is this whole area of licensure, as you explained it, is fraught with special interest political stuff. And I'm going to have a paper out with Cato, I think probably by the fall, and Daniel Sims has a book coming out in which we'll be discussing this before the Democratic Convention. But there are a lot of ways to fight licensure, but I'm afraid it's not good as a democratic process because the special interests always seem to have an upper hand over the general interest. So with that, I'll let you comment and get offline here.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for what the Goldwater Institute has done. I'm actually going to be on another webinar tonight with Heather Curry from the Goldwater Institute. We're going to be talking about occupational licensing again. So I would agree with much of what you say there. We have in Nebraska a limited sunrise. Sunrise is for healthcare professionals, primarily folks covered under the Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services. We call it our 407 process. And we see the same thing that you do, that you have all of these interested parties, and some like it and some don't, and they have a little battle about it. So you're right for sure that at the state level you have the influence of the different state groups. In fact, Nicole Fox could probably tell us, she's our government affairs person, but she could probably tell you some stories about what's gone on in the last couple of years in some of our licensing efforts here in Nebraska. I don't know how you get past that except by having organizations like ours and us out there who are willing to go to the committee hearings and go to the 407 committee hearings in Nebraska and in other hearings in other states, and to say, no, wait a second, this is something that we really need to look at. And so much of this happens behind the scenes, and there is certainly money involved in it. I can't tell you how many times while I was in the legislature that we had scope of practice issues with dental assistants and hygienists, and you get this little turf war stuff going on, as I'm sure you know. And so I don't know how we solve that problem, but I think that with I think that certainly a sunrise outside of the scope of practice. Scope of practice is a little bit different, I think, just because you've got somebody that's trying to do more that they couldn't do before, and somebody else doesn't want them to be able to do it. I think that when you start talking about licensing, for instance, we've got interior designers are trying to get licensing, or music therapists, or things like that. I think that some of those kinds of things that aren't currently licensed, it makes some sense to have a true sunrise review, whether we can make it a true sunrise review and actually do the review. But I think that before you even start down the path of creating a new license, you need to do a thorough analysis of whether or not it's really needed.
Murray, any last comment, or I'm going to open up for another question?
I agree with Laura that it had its place, or has a place, with stopping new licenses. It's just that we had seen more abuse than we had good results. I think one of the things that I've been writing about and will be published soon is I really think the way to get rid of occupational licensure, there's two ways of looking at it. And I call it Uberization, that we got rid of the taxi medallions when something a lot better came along. And it didn't take an act of legislature, it just made it economically infeasible to keep that out there. And I agree with Laura, there's so many better ways to assess physician competency. I do think that the day will come, I think, to telemedicine and this COVID crisis is going to accelerate more liberalization in states because they're going to have to. I think as, for example, advanced practice nurses become ever more beloved in the population, that they too will get enough political heft behind them that they'll be able to make changes. And I always go back to a process where we quote license, or better use the word certify, on the basis of skill. When you think about it, an airline pilot is the model I like to use, because no one has more critically needed skills at any moment by moment. You could argue whether it's a surgeon or a pilot, both of them have critical skills that have to be exercised. But we don't have political problems with airline pilots because they're tested on the basis of skill. They're certified. It's a non-political process. So even more important than getting rid of licensure, I think, is depoliticizing the process. And I think that's something that can and will be done.
Very good.
Yep.
Charles, I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Jeff. And Dr. Feldstein and Senator Ebke, regarding Uberization and giving consumers something more useful than licensing, which really is just a protectionist scam by incumbents. What about, Murray, your former Goldwater colleague that has that proposal I've always liked, and we had Byron Slomak propose privatizing licensing by giving certification a stronger leg in the states, where if you are certified in a registered organization, you can exempt yourself from licensing. What about that proposal that's always out there? And Laura or Murray, have either of you thought more about that?
Well, Byron and I put out a joint paper that got published in the Goldwater, on the Goldwater website. And Byron used to work with Goldwater. He was at one time a member of the Goldwater Institute. And so what he has proposed, and Shirley Sforny, who's also a very well-known voice in, she's a Cato scholar who publishes regularly about licensure, pointed out that we could have a dual track, very much like, again, Ubers and taxis. You can still buy an Uber a taxi medallion in New York. It's just they're only worth a tenth of what they were before. And people still ride the cabs. You don't have to change that. But as long as you get rid of the exclusivity of that and allow competition in, the market sorts it out very, very quickly. So now there's a lot more people taking Uber in New York than taking taxis. And so what Byron has proposed, and Shirley and I proposed kind of independently, was that we set up a track where people get certified on the basis of their specialty certification boards. And that as long as that board is recognized by the state, then they automatically get the scope of practice for which they've been certified. No one can stop it. Now, there's a lot of pure libertarian arguments against that, I realize, but I wish we lived in a pure world. We don't. And there's always going to be something better, ideally. But to get things done in the real world, you got to start somewhere. And so that is a way that I can see in which you evolve a system whereby private licensure takes the lead role, like Ubers have taken the lead role in many urban areas of transportation.
I can tell you a little story about something we did here in Nebraska, or we tried to do here in Nebraska this past year. Last year, I guess at the end of 2018, right after I took the Platte position, I had the interior designers came to me, and they wanted to be licensed, and they wanted to know how much the Platte Institute would fight that. And I said, well, we'd probably fight it. But they explained to me that their issue was that they didn't want to exclude people from being able to be interior designers for homes, or, you know, to work with a local contractor to figure out where, you know, they should put the cabinets and things like that. That their concern was interior design, that there were some interior designers specifically for the more commercial type buildings, that they wanted to be able to go put their own stamp on it. They wanted to go to the building inspector in the city or the county and get their own stamp, but they couldn't get a stamp because they weren't recognized by the state. And so what they ended up having to do was go to an architect or an engineer who held domain over the stamps for the state. They had to go to them and pay them to stamp their plans so that they could take them to the building inspector. And so once we started talking about it, you know, not everybody wanted to do that. And so what I said to them was, well, how about this? How about you, you know, if you've got your national certification, the people who have spent the extra time to get the national certification, taken the test, they've been certified as, you know, experts in the field, able to do that. What if we use that as a means of recognition for certification? And so the bill that we had drawn up was, you know, if you had this certification, it means that in most cases, you've not only done the 4 years for, you know, the basic interior design bachelor's degree, but you've also taken some graduate level work, and you've gone and, you know, done taken 2,000 hours or something like that of a practicum, and you've taken the test. If you've done that, then you can call yourself an interior design, a certified interior designer, and you can go to the Secretary of State. I guess we went to the Secretary or the Treasurer's office, but, you know, some state agency, and they will issue you a stamp, which is then recognized by a building code stamp, which can then be recognized by the building inspector. Then we said, but I said, I don't want you to have exclusive use of the name. So they said, no, we don't want exclusive use of the name. We've got lots of people who've had 2-year programs or 4-year programs who really all they want to do is they want to be out in rural Nebraska, and they want to be able to help local contractors figure out where the cabinets are best situated, or where the doors should be, and things like that. Good enough. So we had a great bill. And wouldn't you know it, and as Dr. Feldstein I'm sure knows, the people who came in and opposed it in committee were the architects and the engineers. And so, you know, we were close to getting that one through. I think maybe next year we'll get it out of committee, but it is a great frustration, because you're not taking anything away from the practice of, you know, of the engineers or the architects. All you're doing is you're allowing somebody else to do something that they're trained for.
You know, I have a saying, and I think that if you could somehow promulgate a principle that you're competent until proven incompetent, and if you could get an idea like that in the state, so that people will have to prove that what they say, that you're incompetent, the onus is on them. And I think that's the kind of general principle we should be pushing. We got dental therapists finally, after a couple different tries, in the state of Arizona, licensed a year ago or so. And of course, the dentists just fought that tooth and nail. And when we finally won, it was kind of a limited victory. The dentist had said, oh, this is going to just be terrible for the health of the people. People are going to die if somebody pulls a tooth. They'll bleed to death if they don't know how to do it. But when we finally got it passed, it was restricted to the Indian reservations and community health clinics, so that the dentists were able to, in their own internal publication, say, this is a victory, they're only going to be in these areas. So basically what they were admitting is if it was a non-paying patient whose health was affected, that was really a victory. It's only the paying patients whose health is kind of important.
They didn't care if they weren't going to get anything out of it.
Well, let me put it this way. I wouldn't want to impugn dentists with that, but I will say this, that the Arizona State Dental Association's publication had that as an editorial. So if anybody were to argue with me, I bring that article out, and I kept a reference on that, so they could see that what I was saying was, maybe it's not how the dentists themselves feel, but it's certainly how the editorialists on their state publication felt.
And I think from a healthcare perspective, and I'm sure you may agree with me, that many times it is the organizations that take these positions, whereas the actual practitioners don't care and don't really know. I mean, my husband is a family physician, and he has a practice that has several nurse practitioners and several physician assistants, and he doesn't really care what they do. He thinks increasing their scope of practice makes life easier for him. So
you're absolutely right. The average doc, dentist is not a political animal. They just want to take care of sick people the best way they can. And so it's a shame, but it's the nature of, it's one of the weak points of democracy. Let's just put it that way.
It's what makes it a grind, because like you see, we keep moving forward little by little, but it's just like that water trying to inch its way through the rock. You finally get there, but geez, why did we not get there? We all found out so we wanted to be here in the end anyway. Why did we take so long to do this type of thing? David, I see you've got your hand up.
Laura, on the topic of universal recognition or reciprocity, it strikes me as a double-edged sword. So I think the last thing that we want is to give the feds an opportunity to muscle in there. Now, I'm in favor of the idea of universal recognition, but only in the guise of a greatly expanded private merit-based rating agency system, probably competitive between agencies. So any thoughts on keeping the feds out and expanding private rating agencies?
Sure. Well, typically the universe, and part of it is the semantics, the language that we use. Typically, when we talk about universal recognition, we're talking about, as opposed to reciprocity, and we've moved to calling things recognition a lot more, because recognition implies one state saying that we are going to recognize licenses from other states. Reciprocity implies that there's some sort of a two-way agreement. So there's a lot of reciprocity agreements out there where Kansas and Nebraska have a reciprocity agreement that says that their veterinarians can cross the border and can legally practice across the county borders and things like that in the state. But recognition says that if you have a license in Colorado and you want to move to Nebraska, doesn't matter what it's in, if it's universal, doesn't matter whether you are a cosmetologist or an electrician or a physician, or any, and physicians have it a lot easier these days because they have all of these compacts, but doesn't really matter what you're in. Our state is going to recognize your license and your experience as adequate for our licensure purposes. So basically it says, move here and we'll give you a license if you were licensed someplace else. We've seen those problems, especially with respect to military folks. And we've seen efforts in that recently that we have, and Nebraska has done a couple of them as well, where states are saying, well, we should have universal recognition if you are in the military or you are the spouse or family member of somebody in the military, that, you should be able to come here because you're only going to be here for a few years anyhow. Our argument is that we ought to, if it's good enough for military families to come here and be recognized without having to jump through a whole bunch of hoops, why not for everybody? Arizona has largely done that, with the exception of some of their. I was talking to Heather the other day, and they've got a few things that are kind of outside of their scope, but for the most part, they have universally recognized licenses from other states. Why not everybody? And the feds should not be involved in it. The feds are almost are pretty outside the scope of occupational licensing from a I would argue from a constitutional standpoint that doesn't fit within federal guidelines at all.
So you would continue with state certification?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. State certification, state recognition. You may have national organizations that are involved in the certification program. So the National Interior Designers Association, or there's any number of national organizations that provide extra certification for people in specific occupations, but they're private organizations that have that kind of certification. And so I would argue that we make the switch and allow those folks be the sort of standard, where if we're going to add any kinds of new licensure, but really, I don't really care if you're a cosmetologist in Iowa or North Dakota or Montana or any place else. I've lived in 3 or 4 different states when my husband was in the military. I honestly couldn't tell you that there is a difference between the haircut I got in Tennessee and the one in North Carolina and the ones that I get in Nebraska. So I don't think that one state's licensing standards for an occupation are necessarily superior to the to another's. I mean, there's something to be said for experience.
What about Murray's idea of more of a rating, a merit-based rating as opposed to certification?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's all sorts of possibilities, and I think that there's a lot of the think tanks out there that are talking about those different possibilities, trying to figure out what, I think that once we get a few more states that land on a good model, that other states will follow along. We just haven't cracked the door quite far enough.
For sure. I see you got your hand up. We can slip in one good last quick question.
Certification in the medical industry. 1 minute, sorry. Okay, so yeah, I'm unmuted.
Yes.
So my question is about the medical industry. As opposed to barbers, there's a substantial difference, I understand, between the training that nurses get and doctors. So whenever this issue of certification comes in, doctors are vehemently opposed to expanding the scope of practice for nurses. And there seems to be a valid argument, unless there's some other way to take into account the experience of nurses and their expanded skill set as they go through life. So my question then is there a valid argument there that you really can't expand the scope of practice for nurses without having a detrimental effect on the quality of healthcare?
Well, I'm sure Dr. Feldstein wants to say a little bit too, but I will say that for one thing, we're not talking about the standard RNs, registered nurses. We're talking about the advanced practice nurses. They typically have gone back to school. They've taken additional training, and I don't know what all the standards are, but they have to pass certain board certifications, and they specialize in particular areas. So some of them are healthcare or mental health, advanced practice nurses. Some of them are family practice. Some of them, they do all sorts of things. And then you have the nurse anesthetists and things like that. I don't know, Dr. Feldstein.
Well, yeah, the advanced practice nurses include uh, nurse practitioners, nurse anesthetists, nurse specialists who do the various things that work under protocol in areas of cancer, mental health, things like that. And you also have nurse midwives. And so these advanced practice nurses sometimes have more years of training even than physicians. If you count all 4 years of college, which is what physicians always count when they say I've gone out of high school and I've worked 16 years, that might include sometimes devoted to football games and frat parties before they ever get to their preclinical stuff. I will say this, I think there's really good arguments that says that anything that medicine can be delicensed with no adverse health effects. And I'll make that as a blanket statement. There's a lot of qualifications, but here's what I would propose. That I think the place to start to really concentrate on getting depoliticized is in medical licensure. Because if you can get that through, you can get any of them done. You've won the war. You fought the biggest battle first. Instead of everybody saying, well, medicine's different, it's not, believe me. And we could discuss this forever, but Kishore, to your question, there have been so many studies that have shown that when a nurse is prepared and certified to do what she does or he does, then you can't tell the difference in outcomes clinically between whether it was an MD or a certified nurse practitioner or what. And in fact, what we're saying is if they're certified by a board, and that board is the good certification board, and by the way, there's organizations that rank certification boards. So if this is a recognized bona fide certification board, then if they practice what they've been taught, then they're okay to go.
Very, very good. Well, sadly, we've reached the conclusion here of yet another, as I promised, was going to be an interesting episode. And I definitely want to thank Laura Ebke with Murray sitting in today for being here with us.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I really enjoyed it.
It was very educational, and it feels like we've made progress, and there's definitely a lot of progress that we're about to make. So that was very exciting.
Absolutely.
So thanks again.
Thanks.